Hello YouTube, welcome back. Chris here. Today I'm going to do a walkthrough on how to remove a square taper crankset from a bicycle. In front of you I have a few different tools. On the left we have a CCP-2, CCP-22 from Parktool. These are your square taper crank pullers. The CCP-2 is just an older version. The 22 is what you would buy if you were buying one today. The only real difference between these two tools is going to be the head. The 22 has a bulkier replaceable pin here to contact to make it a little stronger tool. Other than that, it's virtually the same thing. So if you have a 2 or you have a used one you find, it will work just fine. But the modern tool is the CCP-22. On this side, you'll see a CCP-4 and 44. This is not the correct tool for square taper, but I figured I'd discuss it because I'm sure a lot of people see this and think it's a square taper puller. This is actually for ISIS spline or Octolink or anything that is not is a little bit bigger. So you can see the interface here is bigger. So this will not work on a square taper, and vice versa. You want to use your CCP-22 on a ISIS or Octolink or anything like that. So if you do have one of these, great tool to have, handy, but not going to be used for this procedure with a square taper. So these are what we need. Now if you're not familiar with what a square taper crankset is, I'm going to show you here. This is a square taper bottom bracket. It has a shell diameter, typically 68 or 73 millimeters wide. It also has a threading to it. This is called an English thread. They also have a Italian thread and actually a French thread, not very common, but something you may see. And then it has a square spline to it that interfaces with your cranksets. This is where your bearings are. This is also a sealed cartridge bottom bracket, more modern, and some of the older ones will be loose ball bearing with an actual spindle and cups. But if you're using a more modern one, it's probably going to be a sealed one. If you buy a decent quality, that's what you're going to get, which is much better than a loose ball bearing one. Square taper crankset looks like this. I don't have the left crank arm here, but it's basically the same thing. And basically what's going to happen is that square spline will fit with your square bottom bracket, and then you just have a bolt that will go through here. For installing the cranks to the bottom bracket, you don't need any tools. You just put in you don't need any specific tools. You just need an 8mm Allen wrench to this to tighten that up, which is pretty common. But to get it off is what we're going to demonstrate here, and that's where you need your CCP-2 or 22. So let's hop over to a bike here and show you how that's done. Okay, so here we have our square taper crankset on a bike. First thing we're going to do in removing this is take our 8mm Allen wrench and take the bolt off. This part's pretty simple. Just break it loose and pull the bolt out. This one has quite a bit of grease in it, but they don't always have that. Next, you're going to take your CCP-22 or 2. Now this has two parts. It has a moving part, and that's what's going to go inside the hole in the crank here. And then a pin here, much like a chain tool that you'll use to push on the actual spindle. So we're going to go ahead and get this started. Threading it into the bottom bracket. Now one thing to keep in mind, you want as much of that threading in the bottom bracket as possible. Let me see if I can give you a closer view here. So as much of that threading in the bottom bracket as possible. Make sure to back this out so the pin isn't hitting and allows you to thread that in. If it's not going in far, grab a crescent wrench and give it a few extra turns. This one went in pretty smooth, but sometimes they don't. You want to have as much of that threading in as possible so that when you do start to extract the crank, you don't just rip the threads out of the crankset, which can happen. So now that I've got that in there nice and sturdy, I'm going to start to wind my crank puller until it touches. Once it touches, you usually just need one good push and it should break it loose from the bicycle. From here, the crank should just slide right off, and there's your square taper and our tool. The tool will often get stuck in the crankset So you may need a crescent wrench to get it out, especially if you use the crescent wrench to put it in. When it's under the force of extracting that crank, it often gets really tight in there in the threads. So then we back our tool off and our crank set is off. As I mentioned before, if you're installing this, other than a torque wrench, if you want to do it the proper way, you really don't need any specific tools. You just kind of slide the crank set on, take your bolt, and tighten it up. So that's all for this time. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, concerns, comments, please leave them below, and we'll see you next time.